Hello everybody, welcome back again. Today we're going to talk about something that may be not the most exciting thing in the world, but if you're into it, it's fairly interesting. We're going to talk about, briefly kind of, the history of rail. Why it looks like what it does today, and how it evolved on the Perkiomen Railroad especially. So, whether you're out on the class 1 rail, or you're out on a historic railroad, or pretty much anywhere you go these days, the rail kind of resembles this. And the rail that you know today, the style, the shape, the size, all that stuff, is a far cry from what it looked like originally when rail first started being used for railroads. Even in the earliest days, before you had locomotives, you had rail, but you had cars being pulled by mules or horses. But that's way back, and that's another, as I always say, that's another story for another time. But the rail definitely did evolve over time, mostly because of larger locomotives, larger cars, heavier freight cars, longer trains, etc., etc. Rail basically evolved from its earliest forms to what it is today. I think as of now, I think the heaviest rail you can find is a 155-pound rail. I think that's the heaviest. This piece in front of us is, I would believe, 130-pound. They had some oddball 131-pound rail, but I think this piece of rail that you see here is a 130-pound rail, which is pretty much the norm on commuter lines, class 1s, modern day rail. A lot of, like I said, class 2s, class 3s, a lot of tourist lines that are run on basically non-updated rail. A lot of them currently run about 100-pound rail. So, to those of you who don't know, as I'm talking about 100-pound rail, 130-pound rail, I'm sure a lot of people who aren't really into trains as much probably don't know what that means. When you hear somebody say 130-pound rail, or 100-pound rail, or whatever, that basically means every 3 feet of rail weighs 100 pounds. If it's 100-pound rail, every 3 feet weighs 100 pounds. If it's 130-pound rail, every 3 feet weighs 130 pounds, etc., etc. And like I said, I think this piece here is 130-pound. Sometimes it's marked on it, a lot of times it's not. This is not quite 3 feet long, obviously. If it was, I wouldn't be able to move it as easily because it would weigh 130 pounds. So in the earliest days of rail, basically the rail, the ways of attaching it to the ties, everything was way different. It did not look anything like it does today. Actually, in the earliest days of rail, instead of having ties, they actually were anchored into stone, believe it or not. Some of the earliest railroads, instead of having ties, the rail was anchored into stone. Very, very few examples of that stone exist. Railroad Museum of Pennsylvania, if I recall, I think they have a couple of them. I think some were found along some trail, not the Perkiomen, but somewhere. Can't remember where, but if you look it up, in the earliest days, before railroad ties, you actually had stone with holes in it that held the rail down. So like I said, there's different ways of attaching the rail. The rail was in various oddball shapes. I mean, as far back as 1820, it was pretty much the earliest rail known to man. It was right around 1820, and like I said, it was very unique. Until about 1858 is when you basically got the first shape of rail that kind of resembles what you're used to seeing today in 1858. It was 65-pound rail. Now, for some reason, in 1864, the next line to come out was 67-pound rail. Not sure why it dropped. I mean, why it only went up 2 pounds. I'm not sure what 2 pounds difference would do. But why they only went up 2 pounds, I have no idea what that would actually help. But I guess when you're dealing with 39 or 40 foot sections of rail, it makes a big difference. So then, sometime I think it was 1865. It was there was that they changed a little bit, which was called the Bessemer rail, which came into the United States. That was 50-pound rail. So I never heard of Bessemer until a little while back when I was researching it. I'm not 100% sure what it means, but they said that it was introduced to America. So some of the older rail may not have even been made here. I know in Boyertown there's a section of guide rail which is actually from the I think it's the 1830s, which is some of the oldest known rail in the state of Pennsylvania, and that's actually from England. So maybe we didn't get our rail. Again, like I always say, I research and I have general knowledge of many things, but I don't know it all, and sometimes I forget to research certain things as I go deeper into it. But anyway, where was I? So it says introduced to America. Whether it means introduced or that was the first, but I know early on we got a lot of our rail from overseas. So the 1865 rail, for some reason, it actually dropped to 50-pound rail. So this, or that, takes us back to the Perkiomen. The Perkiomen Railroad was chartered as the Perkiomen Railroad after a couple name changes and a lot of delays, mostly due to the Civil War. After being renamed for its third time and rechartered as the Perkiomen Railroad Company in 1865, construction started 2 years later in 1867. So by 1867, the first rail that was on the Perkiomen was 50-pound rail. So that's when, like I said, that was the original rail. We actually have year-end reports and financial reports and progress reports, whatever you want to call it, from the Perkiomen Railroad from that time, and it clearly states that it was 50-pound rail that was being laid on the Perkiomen. I mean, obviously, that was the standard of the time, and that was the biggest rail of the time, so of course it would have been, of course it would have been 50-pound rail. Then, sometime after 1900, again, like I said, because as we evolved through time, engines got larger and heavier, passenger cars got larger and heavier, freight cars got larger and started hauling heavier freight, and the trains, because of the larger locomotives, the trains got longer. So, of course, the rail got bigger. So in 1900, the Perkiomen Railroad converted to 100-pound rail in 1900. So there is a few sections. We found a piece or two that were used for, basically for stanchion type poles or whatever in the ground for when people chained off their property across the rail back in the days of the post-railroad pre-trail days. There's a couple spots which we think may be 50-pound rail. It's very small. In 1876 there was 60-pound rail introduced. We don't know for a fact if the 60-pound rail was ever used on the Perk. It could have been converted, but 38.5 miles of rail is a lot of rail to convert. So we have a feeling that it may not have seen 60-pound rail, but it could have. But we do know for a fact that it started with 50-pound rail on the Perkiomen. And then after 1900, they upgraded to 100-pound rail. Like I said, when I say poundage, that means every 3 feet of that rail. So if you take a 39 or 40 or 30-foot piece of rail, divide it up and do the math, it's a heavy piece of real estate. So basically, the railroad, I mean the Perkiomen, along with most railroads, stayed at 100-pound rail for many years. 1916, they moved up again to 130-pound rail. Well, Perkiomen didn't upgrade to 130-pound rail until after World War II. 1945, they converted the rail on the Perkiomen to 130-pound rail. Again, to keep up with the larger trains, etc., and to accommodate the T1s. Because the famous Reading T1s were now in service and actually doing coal drags coming through on the Perkiomen. So after World War II in 1945, the rail was upgraded to 130-pound rail, which stayed there until it was removed, And the part of the rail that's still in service yet from Pennsburg to Emmaus is still 130-pound rail. And if you look at some of the tie plates in there are actually stamped 1945. So we could only imagine that those were brand new tie plates and have been sitting there since 1945. So, which the Perkiomen, after it became a part of the Reading, became the Perkiomen branch of the Reading in 1945. Is, like I said, it's when they converted to heavier rail. Because the Perkiomen was not a main line, it was still a branch, but it was such a popular, heavily traveled line. It was almost like a main line to a sense. So it was one of the few branch lines that the Reading converted. It ain't the only one, but it's one of the few they converted at that time back then to 130-pound rail, which was a good thing. It was also a bad thing because after passenger service stopped and they started losing a lot of freight, and after parts of the line were damaged by Hurricane Agnes, the rail was removed because at that time the Reading was approaching bankruptcy. And of course, like I always say, railroads make a lot of money, but they're also very cheap. So that 130-pound welded rail that they had was removed to be used elsewhere on the main lines of the Reading. Some was scrapped, some was used on the main line. So it was a good thing and a bad thing. So like I said, it helped the railroad progress, but then by the time the Reading needed rail and parts of the Perkiomen branch were already out of service. And yes, those who always wondered that question, it was pretty much, even though the Philadelphia and Reading, which became the Reading, had controlling interest in the Perkiomen almost since day one. They stepped out for a few years in the 1800s, but it was always the Perkiomen Railroad with controlling interest by the Philadelphia Reading, or the Reading, whatever, later on the Reading, until 1945 when the Perkiomen Railroad ceased to exist and it became just the Perkiomen branch of the Reading. So anyway, so like I said, that's a little history of the rail. And as you can see, this is like modern day. This down here is 130-pound rail also. When you upgrade the rail, you have to upgrade the tie plates too, because the base of as the rail got heavier and larger, it got taller and it got wider, and the base plate were bolted to the tie plate got wider too. So you can see here, those are the spikes. The Reading, here's this tie plate here. By the way, we are not on the Perkiomen right now. We're very close to the Perkiomen, but we're not on the Perkiomen. This was 1940 right here. Actually, this is actually 100. Okay, I said about there's some oddball 131-pound. This rail you see right here is actually 131-pound rail. Because sometimes if you look, it'll have the year on the tie plate, it's 1940, and you will also have the weight sometimes. The weight and the size and the manufacturer oftentimes will be stamped on the tie plate. Not always, but oftentimes, just like on the rail. One of the major sources for rail and most about everything that was cast, Reading got from the Bethlehem Steel Company. Sometimes you'll see BS Co. or other types of older stamps on the rail. That meant the rail came from the Bethlehem Steel. So I never noticed this before, but yes, this is actually 131-pound rail. So this piece was probably cut off of it, so that's probably 131-pound rail as well. Kind of odd. Like I said, most of it's 130, and I think this 135 came a little later on. And that's a roller bearing, early days. Almost looks like this was converted from friction bearings. This looks like a journal box. Looks like a journal box here. You can tell, like a journal box was later updated. What they did oftentimes, as they upgraded and got away from friction bearing, actually a lot of railroaders, it makes their head split when you say friction bearing. They don't like that term. Plain bearings, which weren't even bearings at all. But you had journal boxes, you would have had a journal lid here, you would have had wicking in there and the packing and the journal grease, etc., etc. As they update it, oftentimes they took the old trucks and they just put the roller bearings inside. And this clearly looks like this was probably converted from a friction bearing truck to roller bearing. But that's another story for another time, maybe another video. So anyway, I want to thank you once again for listening to me babble, and hopefully you learned a little something about rail. And I will see you next time.